Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today for the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding webinar on how advocates can help stop President Trump's $7 billion cut to HUD in its tracks. My name is Elaine Weiss and I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or CHCDF, is an education strategy and action hub for national organizations dedicated to adequate federal housing and community development funding for lower income families and communities. CHCDF members represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations, including faith-based, private sector, financial intermediary, public sector, and advocacy groups. Joining us today on today's webinar is Diane Yentel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Barbara Sard, Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Trey Reffitt, the Policy Director at Local Initiative Support Corporation, and Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Let me just a few pieces of housekeeping information. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type it into the question box. Please use that rather than the chat box. And note that we'll answer the questions at the end of the webinar. And we will have both the recording and the PowerPoint slides made available to you. You'll receive them in an email tomorrow, I think about 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, Sarah, for that piece of housekeeping. So this is our agenda today. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to Diane to give some opening remarks.
Great, thanks Elaine, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. We have over 3,000 organizations that registered for this webinar today, which I think tells us a couple things. One, that things are very dire, that the threats facing affordable housing and community development programs are more significant than they've been in years, maybe in decades. And it tells us also that we are together ready to activate and to mobilize, and together we can be very powerful. We've been really heartened by the number of people and organizations that have been reaching out to find out what more you can do to protect these vital resources. And that's what today's webinar is all about. Because Trump's budget is even worse than many of us feared it might be. In order to increase the military budget by tens of billions of dollars, he would eliminate or drastically reduce much of the country's social safety net for low and moderate income households, including seniors, veterans, people with disabilities, families with kids struggling to get by. And at a time when the United States already spends more on its military than the next 8 top spending countries combined, and when America's pervasive housing crisis has reached historic heights, impacting most severely the lowest income people, the proposed budget truly is unconscionable and unacceptable. Just as a few examples of why. President Trump would cut or drastically reduce vital resources assisting some of the most vulnerable people in rural, urban, and suburban communities alike. He would eliminate community development block grants, which provides communities with flexible funding to address local needs as varied as Meals on Wheels programs and food banks for isolated and hungry seniors, to creating homeownership opportunities for lower income families. He would eliminate the Home Investments Partnership Program, which provides critical gap financing to make the construction and rehab of affordable homes possible. He would eliminate entirely funding for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, of NeighborWorks America, and of the Legal Services Corporation, which is often the only resource available to help low-income people avoid unwarranted evictions. And the list goes on, right? He would eliminate LIHC that keeps the heat on throughout cold winters in the homes of seniors and families with young kids. He would eliminate support programs that provide services to homeless and at-risk veterans and their families. Outside of the budget process, Mr. Trump seeks to implement work requirements for Medicaid recipients, putting punitive requirements between some of the most vulnerable veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, and their necessary, often life-saving health care. I think this effort and others like it leave little doubt that Mr. Trump will try to move forward with planned efforts to attach similar requirements across the social safety net. So there's three things that I think are important to keep in mind about this budget proposal. One is that despite the spin from the White House, this budget has nothing to do with reducing the deficit. It would increase military spending at the expense of resources serving struggling households throughout the country. The second thing to know is that while the proposed HUD budget claims that it can find savings of over $3 billion through quote-unquote reforms, that's simply impossible. Don't believe that one for a moment. The cuts that are contemplated in this budget would necessitate cutting back on the programs that are a backstop between housing vulnerable people and their eviction and possible homelessness. And then the third thing, and maybe most important thing to know about this budget, is that it can be stopped. We absolutely can stop these cuts if we mobilize and act together to prevent them. This budget proposal is just the beginning of what will likely be a long and protracted fight over funding the federal government. You're already likely hearing people refer to the proposal as a marker. It's an early point of discussion and debate. People note that it will not become law. And this is all very likely true. It's certainly receiving a very cool reception even among conservative Republicans on Capitol Hill. And there's a saying in DC that the president proposes and Congress disposes. That's likely never been truer than with this budget proposal, and it's pretty extreme overreach. But at the same time, we have to be very aware that this budget proposal has moved the goalposts so far that it can create an environment where cuts only half as deep, or saving some programs that were slated for elimination while others still receive deep cuts could be seen as reasonable compromises, and they are not, and this is unacceptable. Also unacceptable are any vague promises of replacing these regular annual funding for key housing and community development programs with a one-time spending boost in a remotely possible infrastructure spending bill, which has also been suggested. So the work starts now to defeat this budget soundly. We will work with allies in Congress and with each of you, residents, partners, stakeholders, and advocates across the country to ensure that Congress maintains funding for all critical affordable housing and community development programs. So thank you for taking the time to get on today's webinar. Thank you for your commitment, for your important work, and most of all, thank you for your advocacy now and in the future. It's never been more important. Elaine, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Diane. So next on the call is Barbara Sari from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who will give an overview of the budget.
So I've been having computer trouble. Can you hear me, Elaine, or do I need to call in?
I can hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this call. As Diane has said, the HUD budget itself is pretty scary, combined with the other proposed program eliminations or cuts and the adverse impacts they would have on low-income families and communities. I want to go over some of the same issues and talk a little bit more about how they fit in the overall budget process. As Diane mentioned, the cut of $6.2 billion from the HUD budget compared to 2016, and even more from the level of funding we still expect to see in 2017 based on what the House and Senate had passed, is part of a strategy from the White House to reduce funding for the non-defense discretionary programs overall by $54 billion below the already reduced caps that are due to go into effect in 2018 under the Budget Control Act, while also increasing the amount of non-defense discretionary funding available for immigration enforcement, wall at the border, veterans programs, and other priorities of the Trump administration. It's an inherent math problem. If you don't want to raise revenue, you don't want to cut entitlements, and you don't want to increase the deficit, the only place to go is the non-defense part of the budget, even though, as the slide you're looking at shows, that it's already been cut substantially since 2010. And so while I completely agree with what Diane is saying, that we can beat these cuts if we all work together, we have to realize that this bigger budget strategy that we're up against is going to create some real challenges that will be difficult to overcome. And so what we really need to do is prove the value of these investments so that we can not only preserve them, but come up with a strategy for better funding them in the future and increasing the amount committed to these programs. So what we know on the HUD side is that, first of all, the president proposes to freeze or modestly cut renewal funding for all the rental assistance programs. And the center has estimated that under a renewal, under a freeze scenario from 2016, we would lose about 200,000 vouchers, and we've posted on our website how that would be distributed by state. Now the HUD proposed cut is about 13%. The Department of Agriculture cut would be 21%, although there are no specifics yet that enable us to know what he might be proposing for the rural housing programs. In addition to the freeze on rental assistance renewals, we know that he's proposing to eliminate the Community Development Block Grant, the Home Block Grant, Choice Neighborhoods, and other programs. So the freeze plus the block grant eliminations is only $4.1 billion out of the $6.2 billion proposed cut. And where is the rest likely to come? We know from some leaked budget documents that most of that gap is likely to be made up by about a 30% cut in the funding for public housing. And again, those numbers at the state level are on our website. Of all the congressional observations in response to this budget, my favorite one is from Representative Hal Rogers, a Republican congressman from Kentucky and the former longtime chair of the Appropriations Committee, who said these cuts are draconian, careless, and counterproductive. I couldn't have said it better myself. And as Diane mentioned, the kind of throwaway line that Director Mulvaney of the Office of Management and Budget said that, oh, well, don't worry about these HUD cuts, we'll pick them up in an infrastructure bill, is a promise that you should never believe. It's highly unlikely that that would happen. There may never be an infrastructure bill, given what's being talked about now. If there is one, it may focus only on investments that can be repaid by user fees, as the Trump campaign had proposed, which wouldn't work for any of the HUD programs. And there has been no sign of willingness by the Trump administration or by Republicans in Congress to include money for housing. And under no circumstance would an infrastructure bill cover rental assistance or the kinds of services that are linked, that are integrated in many of the HUD programs. So, as Diane mentioned, this is the opening bid in a long process. And our task together is to persuade Congress and the public that these investments are worth it, indeed that we need more funding for these programs in order to make progress on homelessness, community revitalization, and other goals. And so our goal must be not just to defeat the president's proposal, to defeat the $54 billion cut, but to raise the Budget Control Act cap to avoid sequestration. And so as you can see from the slide, that in 2018, under the sequestration level of the Budget Control Act, we would lose $14 billion adjusted for inflation compared to 2017. And then it would go further decrease of $54 billion under the Trump proposal. Without an increase in the overall NDD cap above the $516 billion level, it will be very difficult to get increased funding for HUD overall. And without increased funding for HUD overall, it will be close to impossible to maintain current rental assistance in terms of the number of households assisted, and at the same time avoid cuts to block grants, public housing, and other programs. So what you're going to hear a lot about in Washington is this word parity, that for any increase in defense spending, there has to be an equal increase in non-defense discretionary spending. And that may sound like words to you, but that is really all about raising this $516 billion cap that the law otherwise requires that to apply across the board. My most important message is don't give up. The Trump proposal is not popular on the Hill now. It will hopefully become less popular as representatives hear from their constituents. An appropriations bill and any change in the Budget Control Act to increase defense spending will require 60 votes in the Senate, and there is no apparent way for the Trump administration to get that level of support in the Senate without a very, very dramatic shift in the priorities in the budget. It will be a long year, but we have to keep up this fight because it's, as Diane said, it is one we can win. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Barbara. That was really informative. So next we're going to move on to our next section of the webinar with Trey Reffett from the Local Initiative Support Corporation, who will provide us with tips and opportunities for advocacy. So Trey, you have a great amount of experience on the Hill. Please tell us some of your background while working on the Hill.
Wayne, thank you, and thanks for everybody on the webinar for joining us. It's a critical time, so it's really heartening to see so many people eager to engage with their communities and their local leaders. So I've recently had 10 years of experience working on safety net and community building. I spent the last year working in the Congressional Affairs as a senior advisor in the Congressional Affairs Office at HUD, and before that I was in Senator Harry Reid's office for 9 years. During my time in Senator Reid's office, I worked on social safety net issues as well as housing and homelessness issues, and you know, fought quite a few fights around doing some of the things that pop up in this budget in terms of drug testing, assistance beneficiaries, in terms of dramatic cuts to programs, scaling back block granting. So luckily, a lot of us have fought these fights. We kind of understand the language and understand what we have in front of us. In addition to those policy areas, I worked with Senator Reid on enactment of the Recovery Act. So seeing how those dollars hit the communities helped us get to where we are in terms of the jobs numbers, reducing unemployment, helping the communities get to where they are today with the enactment of that stimulus bill. So we've seen the real benefits of these programs, and because of that, you know, everybody has a lot of good data they can use to take to their members when they begin their advocacy efforts.
So you have a good sense of what moves lawmakers, what gets them listening to advocates. So We have a lot of people who are eager to do something for the first time in response to the president's budget request, including some folks who have, they don't consider themselves advocates. What's your advice to those people who are reaching out for the first time to their lawmakers? Is there anything they should be doing before they do that outreach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first and foremost, have data. Have the data that is going to back up your request so that you can come and support what you're asking for with results-driven information. So that's key to anything, particularly when we're talking about making or pushing against austerity measures. The numbers that show what we're doing really matter. So that's core to anything. But after that, knowing that everybody has really great data and because our work is really important and really impactful, I would say when you're approaching an office, know your audience. Know whether the member has worked in your area before. Were they formerly a mayor? Were they formerly with a community development organization? Also, people overlook the role of their spouse in these efforts. I think that's important as well, and the state or district director. A lot of these offices, in a lot of these communities are pretty small, so you'd be surprised who associated with that member has worked in with organizations you're familiar with, and those are often leverage points, and that will shape the language that you use when you're bringing in information. Also, when you're meeting with a staffer, know if they're new to the issue, to the member office. Know if they're a seasoned staffer. If you've met with them before, or coalitions that you network with have met with them before, so you know how much background you need to give them. If you have a sense of relationship, that's always important. And also, if they're a seasoned staffer, if you have a relationship with them, you can kind of get a sense whether they're more emotionally driven or data driven, and bring the necessary tools with you. But I would say, in addition to all of that, now more than ever, we need to work on establishing our narrative. We have an incredible story to tell across all of these program areas and the influence of these federal investments in our communities, and we need to do that. And key to investing in establishing that narrative is creating a story, because stories will win the war. Stories plant themselves in people's minds and will be what really drives them forward. You want the data to confirm those stories, but you want something that will make that individual that you're meeting with not forget you, not forget the program that you're advocating for, and not forget the people that benefit from those, and that's the key.
And I'd like to add that the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding is made up of many members who produce and research a lot of data. So if you ever need data, please feel free to reach out to us. We just put out a report called A Place to Call Home that really does make that case for increased federal investment in housing by talking through, why housing helps health outcomes, education outcomes, what the real positive impacts that housing has on people's lives. And it also includes over 100 housing success stories of people who were directly impacted by those HUD and USDA investments. So we've talked a bit about the narrative. When crafting that narrative, what stands out in your mind as the most effective messages to share with members of Congress?
I think making that message hyper-local is really important. If you can get someone in their neighborhood, in their community, that is going to resonate both kind of on a broader level of how they interact with their constituents back home, a message that they can take back, but also on a very personal level. I want to give two anecdotes, both one that affected me and one that affected my boss when I was on the Hill. So in terms of something that really stuck with me, when I was doing my work around the Recovery Act, I went on a tour, a local organization took me on a tour of homes that benefited from weatherization funding. And we went to this one family, and I walked in the door, and the owner of the home was there with her 3 kids, but also her extended family were in the dining room kind of waiting for us to walk in. And they were really excited to tell their story. The woman talked about the small investment of the weatherization program in terms of improving, getting rid of drafts in their home, wrapping their water heater. I think it was ultimately under $1,000 investment, but the impact on her utility bill reduced her need. She was able to get off food SNAP, and she just felt so empowered, and she felt that this tiny investment allowed her to kind of fulfill what she thought a mother should be to her children, and her independence was something that she was proud to bring to her family. And it just, that was, early in my career, but every time I think about it, I get, kind of a little emotional, but also drives me forward in why I was doing some of this work and why these investments are important. And so that time that organization spent on getting me that visit prepared for me, and the warrior I became for those programs and those people in that office, the return on that investment was priceless. And one other anecdote. So when Senator Reid had an opportunity to go back to Nevada, he met with a young woman who was had eaten some bad spinach, and because of that, there was E. coli in that, and she got very, very sick, and it really impacted her life. And she wanted to talk to him about food safety and improvements in our food safety system. And because of that meeting, he went from someone who was a supporter of changes to USDA and improving food safety to a huge advocate for food safety reform, and was a driving force on the Food Safety Modernization Act that passed in 2010. So even when you're talking to somebody that you think is an ally, there is an opportunity to strike an emotional chord with them that turns that ally into a leading advocate, regardless of their position on the committee, regardless of their history. That's why these stories that couple with good data are so essential. You need to, we're doing fantastic work, and we're impacting people's lives, and just confirming that and giving these members something to rally against or rally with is critical.
Great. President Trump, he's really relied on this populist rhetoric throughout his campaign and term in office. However, this budget is anything but that, right? We could all agree on that. How can advocates capitalize on that messaging and turn it on him to further support for affordable housing programs?
And I'm going to keep hammering the same message. I think President Trump has shown us that anecdote can often overcome fact and common sense, and that's why these stories are so important. If you have something that you can hold up as a champion or to point to as why this impacts your community, you can push through a lot of opposition. Again, it really helps that a lot of our work is supported by incredible data. So our job over the next 4 years is to remind people that these programs are not for others, they're for us, that the beneficiaries are not them, they're us, they're ours. We make communities, so we need to tell that story of how our work shapes our communities, has shaped it, and will continue to shape it in a very positive way going forward. So again, it's about how our programs are already in the community, are already helping our neighbors, our friends, or family.
Okay, so you've got your messaging down, it's solid, you're ready to reach out to your members of Congress. What's the best way to do that? Is it through meetings, site visits, the media? What should people do?
And we're at such a critical time, we need to use all the tools we have in our toolbox. I would say you need to think of multiple points of entry into any member's office and to the mind of the member you're trying to influence. Starting out with op-eds and getting stories about your local, or the impact of your work in local media is important, both to get in the mind of local staffers, to get in the mind of the communications director in that office, and just building out your support for members of that community as a whole. Working in the district. I think people often think district is just constituent services and DC is just policy, but oftentimes the district director is as critical in influencing the member as anybody in the DC office. Usually the district director is a long-time advisor for that member, and hearing from that person and the local staff that this is really important to his constituents, his or her constituents, is going to be really important going forward. So don't discount that. Don't just think you have to push this stuff to DC. Also, again, site visits. Trying to get a staff member out to see the work that's being done is important. You're not going to get a member right away. No staffer would let their member go into like an unknown unless they're forced to by the member. But so don't think spending time getting that local staffer to an event, to a meeting, to just a tour of what you guys are doing is not going to pay dividends. I would also say long-term investment, because 1 in 6 members of Congress, including both the House and Senate, are former staffers. So that's an immediate investment that could produce long-term benefits.
Great. So we're coming up to a long congressional recess that runs from April 10th through April 21st. When's the best time to schedule those meetings?
You want to get in early. You want to give those staffers a reason to come out. It's easy for them to kind of focus on what's going on in the Hill, and by the time they're right up against recess, to say, oh, I really wish I had something to justify my travel expense. So get those requests in early, and be flexible with your time, knowing that things shift really quickly. But persistence and flexibility are key.
Okay, so now that you've got your meeting scheduled, what should you do to prepare for that meeting?
So I would say experiences stick in people's mind. So a bad site visit could, even if that staffer or member is sympathetic, could go could really have a long-term impact on your relationship with that member office. So run through your site visit, know who you're talking to, know who where all the steps in the process are, and try to make that as finely tuned as you can to show that you value that member's or staffer's time. That's really important. I've gone on a couple of site visits where I really want to love the work that they're doing, and it just seemed so haphazard that they kind of threw it together at the last minute. Even though I wanted to fight for them, a little bit of the fight is taken away if it just seems like it's a bungled operation and you have to worry about potential bad stories coming out, or because they're not running their processes correctly. I would say humanize whenever possible. Again, this is going back to try to make this hyper-local, try to make this personal, try to give both the staff and the members anecdotes that they could then carry forward that sticks in their mind. And also that you can say, look, this is the impact of your actions, both positively and negatively. The negatively part should be unsaid. You want to try to keep this as positive as possible. Give them a narrative to bring them along. Give them talking points to bring them along.
And should you be reaching out to other groups if you're doing an in-district meeting to perhaps try to coordinate or anything like that?
Yeah, if possible. If you think that you can, there's a story to tell that you're one part of that could benefit from having multiple organizations and multiple sites on a tour, I think that's really helpful, because that could establish kind of a broader narrative. Your group in the morning that leads to, whether you're doing financial literacy and you partner with an organization that then does job placement, then go to a site visit of where individuals have been placed. And that could just think about the narrative that you're trying to set and what could be additive to that. And particularly with the time we're in right now, I mean, people are focused on jobs, going back to Trump's populist rhetoric. How our work is actually empowering individuals to enter the workforce and maintain themselves in the workforce, empowering them to be on their own and empowered individuals. How your time with that staffer could help establish that narrative and allow them to bring that narrative to the press, to their member, that member bring it to the House floor, and support the the request that you're asking of them.
And is there a way you can elevate the profile of your site visit or meeting? I'm thinking, how do you get the media involved?
Yeah, well, I think the media is going to be interested in the member. And having even a staffer doing a site visit and going to the press and saying, hey, we just had this member office engaged. Here is what we took them on. Here is the impact of our work. You can kind of lock that member in that into your organization by saying we showed them the value of our action. So that's a great way to do it. Get the media on board after to try to get a larger profile of your work, on that site, if possible. You can ask if the member's office is okay with having a reporter shadow. That would be a huge accomplishment. I personally would never feel comfortable with that for a couple of reasons. I would be hesitant to ask the real questions that I'd want to ask because I wouldn't want anything directly attributed to my boss if I'm just trying to do a basic fact finding and ask questions in a way that would give me ammunition against opposition. I wouldn't want people to think that I am opposed to these programs. So I would be a little less candid, a little less forthcoming as a staffer. So that's why I always think trying to do that after the visit is better. And then that would give the member's office time to maybe provide a positive response as well.
Great. So we've gone over a lot of things people should do when they're advocating. Are there anything that you would recommend against when doing their advocacy work?
Yeah, if you see things going, well, I would not, you do not want to get into a debate or a confrontation. You want to shape a narrative that brings that office or that staffer or that member along with you. Give them an avenue towards yes. And if you come in confrontational, that's just going to shut them down. If you get into a debate over facts, that's just going to shut them down. Unless you think it's a lost cause and you want to have a pure victory, I would say, any time that you are in a strong debate with a member or staff in one of these settings, you're going to be discounted and you're going to have less of an impact. Ultimately, you want to hand them the tools to be your advocate and trying to do that in a positive way instead of them trying to get in an argument.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Trey, for that. That was really helpful. So again, we are asking Congress and the Trump administration to work together to lift the spending caps for fiscal year 18, maintaining parity for defense and non-defense programs, and ensure housing and community development programs receive the highest level of funding possible. So you can see on the screen that there are some actions that you could take right now. One is signing our letter that has right now over 3,000 organizations and local governments on it, and we'd love to get more support for that letter. We're really quite pleased with how many organizations and governments have signed on, but we know we could always get more. Individuals could also email members of Congress and urge them to protect critical resources for affordable housing by visiting that link. And as we discussed, you could start planning your meetings and invite your lawmakers to site visits. And in order to do those things, we've provided a toolkit which has the Place to Call Home report, which we discussed earlier. We very much encourage you to share that with your lawmakers, especially if it includes those affordable housing success stories from their districts, humanizing the issue. It also includes talking points, sample op-eds, tweets, and how-tos for setting up those in-district meetings and site visits. And if you have any questions, you could feel free to reach out to me and Trey or Barbara related to the budget. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nan for concluding remarks.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks to Diane and Barbara and Elaine and Trey for really illuminating presentations. I was taking notes. And also I just want to say, especially after going through all those resources that the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding is providing, really what a terrific coalition of groups that is, a wide range of different housing and community development groups that have been all working together for years in easy concert to try to build support, general support for those activities. So thank you so much for that. The President's budget certainly is very important. It indicates his administration's priorities quite clearly, and it kicks off the budget season. While the budget, as other people have said, that was just introduced is not going to be enacted as is, it does unfortunately set a bar, and in this case it's a very, very low bar. Starting that low means that almost anything can be claimed as a victory or an improvement over that, and we need to be careful to watch out for that kind of strategy. The President's budget is very important, but it really is only the first skirmish in a much longer war, and we need to get organized for that. There's a lot of process ahead of us for us to be able to get where we want to go. So some of the things we've heard today, and I certainly didn't get everything, and maybe a little of my own thoughts about it. First is just do not hesitate to push really hard now at the outset for what it is that we need, to lay that out now. We have a tremendous argument to make. The programs are effective. They're oversubscribed and under-resourced now. There's all kinds of data about how they work. They link to all of the goals that people have, whether they're liberal or conservative, around effectiveness, around jobs, employment, health, education outcomes, all kinds of other outcomes. We know they're effective. We have lots of stories to tell about it. So we shouldn't hesitate to make a very strong case now and establish where the real bar should be, so that we're looking at a real bar and not at the bar that's been placed there by the administration's budget. The cuts, we should also remember the cuts to the housing programs do not stand alone. There are a lot of cuts in a lot of other areas that are going to be severely impacting the households that we care about and making it even more difficult for them to pay for housing. Proposed cuts in health care, employment supports, education, these things are all going to affect these households. Plus, private sector donors and foundations that are being touted as the people that should be stepping up to fill some of these gaps are going to be sticking their fingers in the holes in the dikes all over the place, trying to stop all these other cuts as well. It's certainly folly to think that their attention is going to be turned to housing. Even if they turned all their attention to housing, it wouldn't be enough resources to solve the housing problems that we have. I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the prize, and that prize is the money. As several people have said, there's a lot of political chatter and diversion going on, but it really is about the money. We can't be diverted by talk about reform and accountability. We believe in reform and accountability. If things need to be reformed, they should be reformed, not eliminated. We need to watch out for discussion about adding things into the infrastructure, about not putting people out of housing. It's like the getting insurance versus access to insurance. There's a lot of language that disguises what's really going on. If there is less money, fewer people are going to be in housing. And that's what we need to watch out for, focusing on the money. And finally, I think we need to bring some new voices to the chorus. Put more public and elected officials, faith-based groups, the private sector. Those are voices that are going to have traction with the current Congress. Smaller cities, rural areas, the middle and south of the country, I think will also need to be heard more loudly. Nonprofit organizations, housers, advocates, big coastal cities, we should all still make our voices heard, but we should also be spending more time mobilizing these other voices as well. It's not just us continuing to say the same thing. We need a lot more people speaking up to these things. And I know from the experience on homelessness that these concerns about people's instability in housing and their lack of housing are becoming much more acute problems around the country, and I don't think it's going to be hard to get these other voices to speak up. We know that housing is the foundation of everything else, that families and individuals cannot achieve well-being without housing. We know that everyone needs housing, and we have a strong, strong case to make, and I know that we will prevail. I have full confidence that we will prevail if we work on this together. So thanks to everybody for putting together all of this information to help us do that today. And I turn it back to you, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Nan, for those inspirational words to close out our webinar. We now have some time for Q&A, so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's been monitoring the board for any questions people have posed during the webinar.
Great, thank you, Elaine. Just a few notes. If you still have questions and haven't yet posed them, feel free to type them in the question box, and we'll try to be able to get to them all. A few people have asked us about very specific programs. We're not going to be able to get to that today. But if you want to email us afterwards, we can try to tell you what we know about those specific programs. So first, to kick things off, we've gotten quite a few questions from people who recognize we've been talking about the fiscal year 18 budget proposal, but have asked about the fiscal year 17 proposal and what prospects are likely for that.
Sure. So, Barbara, are you still on the call?
I am, but I confess to having been double tasking. So that was a question about 2017?
Correct.
So it's uncertain what's going to happen. The optimistic take is from news late last week that House and Senate negotiators were hard at work putting the finishing touches on the 17 bill based on what they had done before, and that they were not prepared to consider the 11th hour 59-minute request from the administration to add more defense spending and reduce the amount of non-defense discretionary spending available for other programs by, I forget the amount, but it was under $20 billion. But in order to accommodate the increased defense request, but that was the appropriator speaking, and it's still, we haven't heard what the Republican leadership is going to do on that. So funding expires April 28th. We think that they'll be ready to do a final bill if they leave it within the current parameters that they were negotiating. If they decide to let the Trump administration intervene at this point, it's more uncertain. And because if they push forward with an unequal increase in defense, a cut in non-defense, it would violate the parity principle that I mentioned when I was speaking, and Senate Democrats have already announced that they will not accept that.
Thanks, Barbara. Sarah, do we have another question?
We do. The question is somewhat similar, but do we have a timeline? People recognize it's now March, and the budget wouldn't be done until October at the very earliest for fiscal year 18. And so kind of wanted to understand a bit more about the process of when things go to appropriators, how that works, and so they can target their advocacy best.
Sure. Barbara, do you want to take that one again?
Sure. So because of the uncertainty around 2017 and the controversy over 2018, treat all this as just today's impression because things change. We expect that the appropriations committees in the House and Senate will at least begin preliminary work in May, assuming they do finish 2017 in April. But it's going to be difficult for them to get very far along in the process until at least each House, respectively, the House and the Senate, have a number that they're working towards as the overall spending for discretionary accounts in 2018. That's called the 302A, and then a division of that pie into the 12 pieces of the appropriations committees. That's going to be hard to do if they can't come to agreement, and may kind of mess things up. I would expect that we'll be lucky to see final FY18 appropriations by December.
Thanks. Sarah, do we have any more questions?
We do. Someone asked a question about how there are so many causes trying to get their stories heard. So what strategies can we take to get our stories heard ahead of what are other very important stories?
So I'm going to take a stab at this, and Barbara and others, please feel free to weigh in. I would say that I would not look at this as a zero-sum game. I think right now one of the benefits of how deep and broad the cuts are in this budget are that pretty much everyone is in agreement that this budget is terrible, and we need to have across-the-board investments in our communities. I think trying to go it alone or trying to step on top of other advocates is the worst-case scenario for everyone. I think looking at building local coalitions and having a united voice is going to be the key to overcoming these very large hurdles.
So you would say that instead of getting mired into the fight about which programs to fund over others and picking and choosing within HUD's budget, that we really should keep that top line message about the need to increase overall funding for housing, but also to stop the cuts to NDD overall.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And if you could have partners with you in the room, you guys can all talk about the benefits of your program, and it does reinforce that, look, federal spending shapes communities in ways that would not be possible any other way. We provide benefits across the board. That's the message that needs to be brought at a time like this.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Sarah?
Yes. One question to kind of sum up and help us to keep going past this webinar. Will CHCDF do weekly or monthly update calls? If not, could you please consider this? It'll certainly help us stay in the know.
That is absolutely something that we are considering and have on our agenda to do. We absolutely want to keep advocates informed so they could continue to do the great work on the ground that we know that they're doing. So again, thank you all for tuning in to our webinar today. There was a lot of great information today that we hope you really take advantage of. Thanks again so much. Have a great day. And with that, we're going to conclude our webinar. Thanks.